Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of React Native Radio. Today for our panelists, we have Jamon Holmgren.
Hey everybody.
And I'm Josh Justice. And today we're having a panel chat and we're talking about JavaScript. We all know a lot about JavaScript, but specifically we want to talk about ECMAScript language features that have come about in the last couple years. Kind of to share about which language features we reach for, which we find are useful. Some folks that are very new to JavaScript may just take these for granted. I wasn't doing a ton of front-end development until some of these were already in place, and so I'm very thankful for some of them that have been able to be a foundation for me. So whether this is new information for you or maybe some historical context on some of these features, we hope it'll be interesting.
When I'm building a new product, G2I is the company that I call on to help me find a developer who can build the first version. G2I is a hiring platform run by engineers that matches you with React, React Native, GraphQL, and mobile engineers who you can trust. Whether you are a new company building your first product or an established company that wants additional engineering help, G2I has the talent you need to accomplish your goals. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about what G2I has to offer. In my experience, G2I is linked up with experienced developers that can fit my budget, and the G2I staff are friendly and easy to work with. They know how product development works and can help you find the perfect engineer for your stack. Go to devchat.tv/G2I to learn more about G2I.
I wanted to plug first, and I've shared this as my pick before, Babel, the tool that most of us use for transpiling, I guess really all of us use in the React ecosystem for transpiling our code. So if anyone is not aware of what Babel is, because it's just kind of infrastructure that runs for you, Babel is a tool that allows you to use the latest and greatest JavaScript features, and it'll transpile them, it'll change your code to work in whatever your target environment is. And so Babel runs as a part of React Native CLI's tooling. If you're doing React on the web, usually if you're using JSX, you're using Babel almost certainly to do the transpiling. And Jamon, I know you use TypeScript more than me. Didn't TypeScript get kind of moved over so that there's a TypeScript plugin for Babel so that even if you're using TypeScript, you might be running through Babel as well? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, that's right. So you can obviously use the TypeScript compiler, which comes with kind of Babel-like features built in, where we'll take TypeScript, which incorporates pretty much all of modern JavaScript features, and then it will you can compile with a target of like ECMAScript 5, which is an older version of JavaScript, and it will compile backwards to that level, which is what Babel does as well. But Babel also, they've been working with Babel now to where it can strip all of the TypeScript features, because TypeScript is mostly just a superset on top of JavaScript. It just has like annotations for types and things like that. Once it strips those things out, it's just JavaScript. And so from there, then you can just run it through its normal Babel transpilation and do whatever you want with it, which is a pretty cool way to handle it. We're still using the TypeScript compiler for most of our stuff. But if you need any additional, transpilation or any other cool features that Babel brings to the you might as well use Babel then entirely.
Yeah, and I've not having used TypeScript too much myself, but really the TypeScript compiler I understood was kind of running alongside Babel. It was another way that people were getting the latest and greatest JavaScript features. And so those two different tools are great ways to try these things out as you're still, especially on the web, needing to target older browsers. And on React Native, the JavaScript runtime that you have available on the different platforms may or may not have the very latest features. So these tools, Babel and TypeScript, BavaScript, I almost said, Babel and TypeScript have been really, really powerful to make JavaScript development much more powerful. And so I've plugged Babel before. I'll do it again. I really encourage everyone and your companies to consider donating to Babel. And we'll put a link to donate to them in the show notes. It's not a large organization. It's a few volunteers. And they're doing really, really awesome work. And it's great that the community is contributing code to it as well. But as you might imagine, it's really specialized code. And so all of us are definitely benefiting tremendously from these tools. And so if you or your company can contribute to them to support it, it just helps all of us working in JavaScript have a better experience.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Open source is really hard to stay sustainable. Obviously, working in open source myself, I know that it can be very difficult to make sure that people don't get burned out, and that they are able to spend the time that they need to spend. And Babel is actually a success story in this, and that they actually have paid their main maintainers through this collective, and that's really awesome.
Very nice. Well, sweet. Let's get into talking about some of these features then. I'll say, I guess, another preface. I'll say I'm going to probably be saying JavaScript and ECMAScript interchangeably. If our listeners haven't run across that before, JavaScript was the original name of the language, and colloquially is what most of us use most of the time. Because of copyright issues, officially the language is called ECMAScript now. And the committee that works on new language features is like the ECMAScript specifications. So oftentimes when people say ECMAScript, they're kind of referring to things related to the latest up and coming features. So just a preface for a while, I'll mistakenly go back and forth as we discuss. The first feature I wanted to mention is arrow functions. So again, this is an older one, and it's been around for a number of years, and so a number of folks are used to them, I'm sure. Arrow functions, as you may have seen, going back and forth between named functions and arrow functions, provide a number of different niceties. The two things that come to mind the most for me is, first of all, the body of an arrow function can be either a block or an expression. Block meaning you're using curly braces, and a return keyword is necessary at the end to return a value. And expressions being you don't have curly braces. And so it can either be on one line, which is nice for really brief ones as a part of a map or something like that. Or you can still make it multi-line by adding parentheses. And so this is really useful, for example, for me when I'm mapping over a list inside my JSX. Oftentimes all I need to do is just return transformed JSX values. And so just using parentheses to avoid a return statement is really, really nice. It keeps things concise and very readable. So the ability to use expressions for return statements is one thing.
Yeah. So I used to do Ruby, and you used to as well, I think, right, Josh? I think that you were an old Rubyist. Yeah. Okay. And that was something that I kind of missed, was the ability to kind of have the last thing in a function return implicitly. And that's something that arrow functions bring if you don't use curly braces. And I used CoffeeScript, and a lot of these features that made their way into mainstream JavaScript were first trialed in a language called CoffeeScript. And CoffeeScript was sort of a weird mashup of Ruby, Python, and JavaScript. And it was a very fun language. It was actually a very kind of pretty language. It was, easy to kind of read. They had a lot of these features built in. And so when I was doing Ruby on Rails back in the day, it would come standard with CoffeeScript and a CoffeeScript compiler, which allowed for compiling back to regular JavaScript code. And arrow functions were a part of this as well. And so I got used to it way early on before it made it into the main language. I got used to using arrow functions. And so when I went to just straight JavaScript, I was like kind of missing some of these features, but then they made it in, early on with just sort of like an experimental feature with Babel, and then we could transform back. And then I was just kind of back in my comfort zone. But it's really nice for things like when you're mapping over a collection. So you have an array of something and you need to transform that, like you said. Then these small kind of fat arrow functions, these stabby functions, whatever you want to call them, they can look very concise and just do one little job, and you can see what they're doing. They're adding two things together, they're concatenating strings, they're maybe calling a different function on it. All of those things are very ergonomic. It's just really simple to use. Some people don't like them. They feel like maybe it's not obvious that it's a function. Maybe that most of the time you should be using the function keyword. I don't agree with that. I think that, generally speaking, if you use them in a way that is kind of is expected, like if you see the map keyword and then you see an arrow function, then you know what's going on. This is this is the iterator kind of going through the collection and running this function. So I'm a big fan. I think that it really cleans up a lot of code, and it also encourages that type of programming, which that kind of programming kind of leads more toward a functional style. It it really makes it so that having an immutable approach to the function or to data is actually a more, I guess, idiomatic way to approach it. It's easier. It's more simple. It feels better when you have some of these features, especially fat arrow functions.
I think that's a great point. It can be easy to say, oh, it doesn't, a few extra characters, it's no big deal. But it makes the difference between how often you reach for a feature versus doing something in a different way. And so those ergonomic differences have an impact over time, for sure. I will say, just even related to that, something was when I was first getting into modern JavaScript development, and I saw the arrow functions, I was like, oh, those fat arrows, like they're a little grating. Like I just don't like how they look. And so I used ligature fonts, Fira Code at first, and then now Dank Mono. I'll find notes and put those in the show notes as well. But like that was an actual resistance to me. I was like, this modern JavaScript, like kind of the arrow functions look ugly, but once it got turned into a nice little ligature, it actually looked like an arrow. I was like, ooh, this is pleasant. Like it's actually kind of cool. It makes me want to do it. So that's how much our emotions play into these things. The other important thing we have to say about arrow functions is the this keyword binding. And we could have a whole episode about this, I'm sure, but this, puns, good times. But the real brief version about that was that I'm sure probably most listeners have run into just the trickiness with the this keyword in JavaScript and how what this is bound to depends on the call set. Not on what object a function is defined on. And so arrow functions help with this because if you're creating an arrow function inline as part of a larger function, this keyword is bound to the same value that it is in the larger function. And so it just, talk about ergonomics, it makes it much, much easier to create callbacks and pass functions around versus having to juggle things around and assign values to make sure you can get the value of this to be what you want it to be or get to that expected value. So that was just a big headache that I think, certainly made code with callbacks much harder to read in the past before arrow functions. And I think it'd make folks much less likely to write that code or write JavaScript, honestly.
Back in the day, jQuery used to kind of do some behind the scenes magic to make this bind to what you would expect it to be. So you would, when you would use jQuery and you would select a DOM object or something on the screen in a web browser, which is mostly, if you haven't used jQuery, and I suspect there's a fair amount in the audience who haven't, it was like you would use this $ parenthesis, and then you could like use a selector, like I want to find all of the paragraph tags, and it would grab all the paragraph tags, and then you could each through them, and you could, set their style, or you could do something like that. But you would use this a lot. So like you would jump into a new function and then you would do $ parenthesis this, and that would bind to the element that you're currently selecting. But in order to do that, jQuery would do some behind the scenes magic to make all of this kind of feel natural. And I think that React was sort of a forcing mechanism for this, because with React, a common thing that you would do is you need to pass through a method to so a lot of times we'd be using classes, which we're going to be talking about as well. This is another new feature, but you're using a class component, and you would have like a method on the class that was like on click button, on click some button, like on click submit or something. And then in the button itself, you would have an on click, and then you would pass through this dot on click button. And the problem is that method would lose its context. So when it was clicked on the other end and inside the button, and you would say, I want to call this method. Now inside that method, this would no longer be bound to the instance of that class. And so you couldn't call other methods. You couldn't say this dot some other method. You couldn't access this dot state. You couldn't access this dot set state. All those things were gone. They were just like poof. It would be undefined, and it was a constant source of errors, like a constant source of problems. And so when that started becoming more of a thing, first you'd have to like bind them in your constructor with React. You'd have to say like this dot on click button dot bind parenthesis this inside of the function, inside of the constructor. If you forgot to do it, you'd have a bug. And then you'd also have this ugly like line of bindings in your constructor, or you could do it where you were passing through the function, but then that brought its own issues where it would be like creating a new function every time that it ran the render. So there were all these like issues that kind of came up with React. And so bringing in arrow functions, both in the class syntax as well as outside of that, kind of solved that, because now the this would stay with that function.
Yeah, seeing that for event bindings is a big place where I see it helping for sure. Let's talk about classes next, as you mentioned. So we're talking here about the class keyword in JavaScript, and it's so funny because in the React world, where the emphasis is shifting away from classes for components towards functions and hooks, and so talking about classes as a new thing seems kind of funny. Before classes in older JavaScript, there was a different mechanism to use for creating instances of things called prototypal inheritance. And one of the things about the class keyword that some folks would criticize is like, well, it sounds like it's class-based inheritance, like other languages like Ruby and Java and others, but it's not actually. It's prototypes under the hood. And again, we can't get into all the details of what that entails here. I will say that whatever pros and cons folks think about classes, that mismatch of like class-based inheritance versus prototypal inheritance, that's never once bit me in any of my work with classes. Like the abstraction of classes has seemed totally fine for me. What about you, Jamon?
Yeah, it's been the same for me. And honestly, for the most part, you should be avoiding classical inheritance anyway, as well as prototypical inheritance for the most part. I think that it's become a lot more of a kind of, I guess, best practice to compose your functionality rather than to inherit it for a variety of reasons that could be its own show. But yeah, no, it hasn't really bit me. I will say that it did seem a little unnecessary to have classes because I was starting to get into more functional style programming at the time, and it felt like, okay, like we're going to add a feature from languages that we don't really need to go back to. But I understood why that was done, though, because like there's still so many people that program in Java, in Ruby, in Python, in other languages that have classes. And to have that kind of basic feature in a language felt like we need this. Otherwise, like why, when people come to JavaScript, they're going to be like, this isn't a real language. And you can't even create a class. You can't even create an instance of a class. And that's kind of why it made it into the language. I hope that now they're going to be a little more judicious with the types of features that they put into the language. You don't want to end up as C++, where like every possible language feature known to man they've added in one substandard way or another. And but for the most part, it actually has gone really well. But yeah, classes, and then it was picked up by React, and so React components were classes for quite a while. Now they've kind of gone back to functions now, but that was a big forcing mechanism for this as well.
Let's talk about a few other class features that have come in since then. That's actually one of the things that I see. I just saw a blog post today about ECMAScript 2020 features and what it's looking like is on track to be included. And I saw that some features that are not yet finalized are related to class properties and class private fields and methods, but those are coming soon. And I wanted to mention those. So class properties refers to, classes do, or I should say like objects, instances of objects created by classes have properties on them. You can assign to them, this dot whatever equals and things like that. But class properties allows you to actually declare them in the class declaration. And so you can assign to them at that point. It's also a way to use arrow functions to define class quote unquote methods. And you get that this binding that Jamon was talking about, which is really useful for passing those methods in as event bindings in your JSX. So that's how class properties work. Private fields and methods are less known. I have a bit of personal interest in this because in a personal kind of research week I got to do with my company last year, I got to help out with the Babel private fields transform. I only did a little bit of work on it. Yeah, I did not start it and I did not finish it, but it was like a few months behind. And so I did some rebasing and I had to like understand, as you might imagine, I had to really understand what was going on inside it to get it caught up with the latest code. And so I feel like I helped out some and I got a credit in the merge and stuff like that. So that was super exciting for me to kind of see just a little bit about how Babel's internals work as well. So that was really neat.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah. But so the deal with private fields is you can think of it as private properties as well. So this is like just bits of data on the object, but they're not accessible outside of the object. There's not even a syntax. It's a syntax error to try to access a private field. And the way it works is you have a dot to access a property like usual, but then there's a bang or hashtag symbol in front of it, and it's a syntax error to access it outside of the class and other than on this dot. And I think that it's interesting, I think adding private fields, one of the reasons, other than the fact that I worked on them, so like I have this subconscious interest in promoting them and using them. But other than that, I think these could be helpful to give folks a chance to really try object-oriented programming in JavaScript in a way that's been more cumbersome before. When you have an object but all the fields on it can be accessed from anywhere, you will be tempted to do that. Even if the code says, this is a private field, don't access it. It starts with an underscore, don't use it. But folks might still do so anyways. You yourself might still do so anyways. And so there was just this sense like all the data of my object is publicly visible anywhere anyway. There's not really any encapsulation per se. Whereas with private fields, it is encapsulated. It is hidden. It can't be accessed or pulled out other than when you create a method on your object that allows accessing that private field. So I wrote a few blog posts at the time to kind of propose ideas for where private fields could be helpful. And in a little hobby project that I'm doing right now, where I'm kind of creating a different kind of data layer, I found myself using classes. And so hiding some data in private fields, I found was really useful to make it very clear to people, like, here's the data you can access directly. Here's the data that's just internal implementation details of this class, and you shouldn't really get in there and mess with it. So I'll post those blog posts in the show notes as well. But yeah, I think there's potential there for these private fields. Another way I'd say it is it just felt kind of dirty to do object-oriented programming in JavaScript. Honestly, as much, I would say because I like OOP so much, it felt kind of dirty to do it because it felt like all of the data was exposed everywhere, and maybe I should just do it with functions, and maybe I should just do it with like variables hidden by scope instead. So I think it creates a good possibility to try out object-oriented design. And, as many of the benefits are seen in functional programming, and I'm sure it'll always have a huge place in JavaScript, the pendulum may swing back a little bit, and we may find cases where OOP is helpful as well.
Infinite Red is a US-based consultancy specializing in React and React Native. They do mobile app and web design and development. They are deeply involved in the React and React Native open source communities, publish the React Native newsletter with 10,000 subscribers, and are involved with the React Native core development. If you have a project and need design or engineering help from an experienced team to take it all the way from concept to completion, get in touch with Infinite Red. Also check out Chain React, the React Native conference, which is hosted by Infinite Red in July in Portland with 500 developers from all around the world. You can find them at infinite.red. Make sure to mention you heard about them in this ad.
Yeah, that's very true that the pendulum does swing. I remember when I was first getting into programming, object-oriented programming wasn't really a thing yet. This is in like the early 90s, and I was like 12 years old, just learning QBasic. And there wasn't really a way to do object-oriented programming. You had like, you could create these structs that would have data, and then you would create functions that would run on them. And then later, I started learning C++, I started learning Java a little bit, and it was like, oh, this is like a brand new paradigm. Here's object-oriented. You have this data, and you have a very defined public interface, and you get to, like push these buttons and pull these levers, and then something will happen internally. And that's what this is about. It's about reducing the surface area of the things that you can touch from the outside, which makes sense to me. I mean, having everything exposed publicly and let anybody manipulate anything that they want seems like a recipe for bugs. And it also allows you to it's kind of a guardrails for when you have a larger organization and they may be using your object, and you want them to only be able to use it in the way that you've kind of predefined and already built in. There's a criticism of this in that people still need to get things done, right? And if they need to get things done and they can't access what they need to access, they may find weird workarounds to get what they need done. Rather than just reaching in and making the changes they need to make, they'll duplicate data, they'll do something, you'll end up with kind of a mess on your hands. So there's some of these knock-on effects that you need to watch out for. Like, you want to make sure that when you're building this, that you have the right organizational processes in place where just because I lock this down doesn't mean that you can no longer get your job done. And obviously, if they have access to the code, they can go in and expose the properties they need or create a new method and just increase the API of that object to do what you need it to do. But yeah, that's I think private fields make sense. It's a part of being an object. If you're going to be an object-oriented language with all the features of being an object-oriented language, you need to have that. You really do. You need to have private fields. You need to have private methods built into the object. It does feel a little weird when you're just working with something and everything is just open to the world. But JavaScript is a little bit that way. One of the things I kind of like about it is that it just feels like working with putty. You're just sort of like, hey, I want an arm here. So I just grab it and I pull out an arm, and it just stretches and it pulls out, like I need to put a property on this object. The original object didn't have that property. Oh, well, I just stick it on there, and I just go like, okay, object dot whatever equals whatever. And now it's there and it's there forever. I've used this to good effect when I'm kind of hacking together scripts or doing some things I need to get done and I need to pass some data through and, hey, here's a passing object. I'll just throw it on there. This obviously is a foot gun, and this will cause problems down the road if you're not careful with it. But it's also an incredibly powerful part of JavaScript.
The argument you made for encapsulation and the benefit on larger projects and larger teams sounds exactly like the argument that I hear for static typing. And that was a parallel I didn't expect to see here. And in fact, the example that I just saw where I was using private fields is some code that I would intend to be a shared library for a data layer, reusable code. And so for myself now to think about what the public interface is and for protection in the future, when I hopefully open source it, it's exactly the same kind of protection that many, many, many in our ecosystem have seen from static typing. So I see
totally
well there.
Yeah, when you're defining the interface and you export the public interface, what you are defining are the public methods. Now, technically, you could call a private method let me step back. You could call a method that's not in the public interface. There are no private methods yet in JavaScript. But in TypeScript, you could do that. But TypeScript would complain to you and say, hey, I don't actually think there is a method by that name. And you can know differently. Having looked at the code, you can be like, no, I've seen this method. I can call it. And you can override TypeScript. But that's kind of the idea behind the interface is that, hey, these are the documented methods. These are the things that have typings. This is what you get to use. The other ones will complain about if you try to use them. JavaScript is going a step further and saying these are actually not available to you. You can't actually call them.
Cool. Let's talk about some of the other language features. The next one I had on my list here was one that has just become controversial on Twitter again in the last couple of days.
Oh, yeah.
The keywords for declaring a variable, the older var and the newer const and let. And we, depending on your fields, we may be able to go over quickly on this one because I had not done enough JavaScript on the front end to see the difference between the older var and the newer let to have that really impact me at all. And I don't have a strong opinion about const and let. If I was on a project that said, hey, always use let versus like, no, only use let when absolutely necessary, which I think are kind of the two views that are out there.
Right.
I have no opinion either way. How about you? Have you seen any kind of marked difference between all of these?
I have not. I used to use var, of course, when I did a lot of jQuery, and then they said, hey, start using let, and I just shrugged my shoulders and said, okay, I'll start using let. I understood the differences. There's some scoping differences. Let is a little less convenient in some situations because of those scoping differences, but it's also a little bit safer because of that. But when I say a little bit, I mean a little bit. To be honest, you could use var everywhere and it would probably work fine. We do use const everywhere where we don't need let. At Infinite Red, I don't have a strong opinion about this. I am totally fine using let everywhere. I kind of get the arguments of, hey, if it's const, you don't expect this to be rebound. That's the big thing here. It's not a constant in that it's like a frozen object, and this is a source of confusion. But it just means it can't be rebound. You can't point it at something else. You can't point it at a different value. You can't point it at a different object. It has to stay pointing at the same object or value. But yeah, we use const everywhere, and it says const, foo equals whatever, and you just know this is going to always stay pointed at this object. I'm fine with that. I think that's a totally fine approach, and I I quickly got used to seeing const everywhere. In other languages, you only see const in very specific situations. At the top of a file, you might define a few constants, and then you're done, and you're moving on. You're using variables, and that probably looks a little more natural to me, having used many different languages. Saying const at the top and saying these are my actual constants, and then the rest of these are just let vars. Let variables, but that's not how we do it. So it's fine. I just don't have a very strong opinion. I know that Dan Abramov wrote an article in his blog overreacted.io. We can link to that in the show notes. But it is titled "On Let versus Const," and he had a previous post that had mentioned that usually you want to use let, and you can use const if you want to forbid something. And that ignited a big flame war on Twitter, apparently. And I don't know, programmers need some work to do. Apparently, I think the holiday season is on us, and they don't want to do any real work, so they're complaining about this.
Yeah, that was the one. I saw the responses to that. I think I saw the horse.js joke about that actually, but I had not read the article. Now that we talk about it, I think that, my very slight preference that comes to mind is because const prevents reassignment, and because I think like reassignment can be a bit surprising. It's like, maybe if something is new, like maybe I want to just declare another variable and give a name to the new thing that has been created. And so I think that might be why I have a slight preference towards using const is like, let becomes a signifier of like, this is one I'm going to assign to from multiple places. Like, make sure you know that. Make sure you're not expecting it to be only once. So it kind of gives you a bit more of an alert. But it would not be strong enough, I don't think, to push back on somebody who had a preference one way or the other.
That's kind of our reasoning. And to be honest, though, most of the time when you see let, it's assigned almost right away. It's like let my variable name, and then you have an if statement, and in the branches you'll be like, if this, my variable name equals this, or else my variable name equals that. It's just right after it. It almost like if JavaScript allowed if statements to be expressions, in other words, return something back from one of their branches, then you could say const my variable equals if this, then that. Now I know you can do that with a ternary expression. We do use that quite a bit just to clean it up a little bit. But that can be a little confusing as well. You know what? It's syntax. It's not difficult. It's not difficult syntax. It's honestly something you can learn. In these situations, I don't think it actually makes that big of a difference to where it in any way sways you one way or another. I would just whatever rules you have, just enforce it at the linter or prettier level, and have that say, hey, in our code base, we do it this way, and then just follow that. You're going to get used to it within 2 days anyway.
That's a great point, and I love plugging ESLint and Prettier. You mentioned earlier concerns that folks have about so many features being added to the language, and I think ESLint and Prettier are two ways to help narrow that down so that like not every file you're in has differences for unimportant reasons. I'm a big believer in a code base of like when something differs, it should be for a reason. And so it should draw attention to it. And so the more you can be consistent, whatever the consistency is, the better. And so like I don't think that probably there's ESLint rules from absolutely everything, although some folks will write custom rules, which maybe I should try one of these days. But yeah, to use that just to pare it down to like, here's our subset of JavaScript. Not to limit your expressiveness, but just to keep the code a bit easier to read and to have things not differ for no reason. So I think that really helped. I would be very, very overwhelmed writing JavaScript if it wasn't for ESLint and Prettier to help with that.
Yeah, totally. They've been a real benefit for us for sure. And you can, if you combine that with TypeScript, then you have a really just you're letting the robots do a lot of the work.
Nice. Let's talk about asynchrony next. One of the more conceptually complex problems in programming, I would say. I remember reading a book about that had a chapter on asynchrony back in the day, and it was like people I super, super respected, and they were like, yeah, humans can't fully understand like threads and asynchrony and stuff like that. And I was like, wow, okay, all right, like that is not, I don't know, maybe I should try to get there, but it's like, it's okay if I can't get there. And it's okay for me not to plan on fully understanding threads. It's one of the nice things about JavaScript's event loop and the predictability that it gives you there. But anyway, that is neither here nor there. We're talking about language features. Back in the day before promises, callbacks were the main mechanism to use to get asynchrony. And like you're calling some code and then asynchronously after a web service request or timeout or whatever, you get called back. And the place that folks may most frequently have seen that is in Express, if you've done work in Node on the server side. So Express still has a callback-based API rather than a promise-based API, and that works all right there. But promises, when those are introduced to the language, that really helps with chaining and constructing more complex sequences of things happening in parallel or in sequence. And I kind of skipped over the callback hell phase of JavaScript, and so I didn't really experience that at the time. Again, I was in the phase where it's like, doing a lot of complex callbacks would be hard, and so folks had not pushed through to that point yet. Then when I was out of JavaScript for a while, people were like, hey, this will be worth it, even though it's hard, even though we get like very deep nested callbacks. So promises apparently really help with that, and it makes sense to me. I just hadn't experienced that callback hell personally to be able to quite, like I get it, but like I can't, when I try to explain to someone, like, what is it about promises that makes sure that allows it to not nest like that? I think there's something there about it just theoretically that my brain can't quite wrap around, but I don't feel like I need to get there. Promises are great. I love to use them. Promises and async-await, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah, tell me about the pre-promises days if you want to.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, totally. No, you're exactly right. And what just visually, if you can kind of imagine this, you would just start having more and more indentation. So you would just, your code would start, instead of looking kind of, if you like zoom out your code or you look at like that mini map on the right-hand side of VS Code, you would see kind of, instead of being kind of like code that kind of like comes down from on the left side and it bumps in a little bit here and there. And it's just kind of like this kind of even bumps all the way down your file. Rather than having that, you would have these big, deep V's. And so you'd see like this long kind of indentation and then it would come back. And as you're kind of scrolling down the page, you'd get lost because it's like, okay, what does this closing curly parenthesis bracket mean? Like, is this an object that I'm closing? Is this a function body that I'm closing? I don't know. Like it's just too nested, and you get these ridiculously deep things. And so there were a few ways to combat that. And this would also happen with promises where you would have .then, deep nested things as well. But there were some ways to combat this. You could define other functions outside of that scope, and you could just say like, okay, this is my callback for this, and then just pass it in by name. But then it started, the problem with that is that things would run completely out of order, because you would see like a function definition, and then you would see where it would be passed in, and then it might be called, and you might be jumping back up. And so if you're trying to read the execution order of the code, you'd be jumping around the file a lot. And it's doable. I did it for years, but ultimately it just became a real hassle. Other languages have had the idea of async-await for a while. I'm not actually sure what languages introduced this concept. I know C# has had it. I know that other languages have had it. But the big thing there was, okay, let's try to make it so that we can have asynchronous code that is non-blocking, because this is important. We need to be able to do other things while we're waiting for this, network request to come back. Or we in Express's example, we're maybe just waiting for someone to send us a request, and then we'll call the callback and we'll return a response. It's kind of the other side of the equation. But we can't just block the whole thread. We can't just sit there and do nothing. That's not very efficient. That was the whole promise of Node, for example, was the idea of being able to handle lots of requests at once. And so this idea of async-await came along, and this is built on top of promises. So promises, you would trigger a function, and then you'd say .then, and then pass in a function that gets called once it's done, but it's just kind of sits there kind of hanging out until then. In an async function, it comes down, so you define it with async function or async function, whatever. And then as you're coming down, you're reading just top to bottom, and you hit an await keyword. And the result from that would get called and passed into the function that is passed into the .then just simply gets returned from that. So you can say const or let foo equals await some function. And then it'll just pause there. and allow something else to happen. And when that comes back, then it will resume that function, and it will, it'll have all of its context. You don't have to worry about a bunch of context being lost. Everything above it is available. Any variables that you've defined above it are available. And then you just keep going, and you can await again if you need to await again. You can even bundle up several into a promise.all and await that. And so it can fire off many different things and then wait for all of them to come back and then continue. So what it does to your code is that it allows you to see that same kind of what I remember from pre-callback, where it was just kind of like everything's against the left side with a few bump ins, and the code just kind of reads top to bottom. There isn't like this jumping around that happens nearly as often. And we've gone back to that, and it's amazing that this language feature has allowed for that while also enabling that kind of asynchronous non-blocking behavior.
Before I forget, I want to share another resource that I've plugged many times. It's Axel Rauschmeyer's resources on exploring JavaScript. In particular, one of his books, he has a number of books on the different versions of ECMAScript, and he has the online versions for free for all of them, and ebooks that are paid that you can buy. I'd really encourage you to check out the free online ones. If you benefit, like I have tremendously benefited, buy the ebook to kind of support him. But the chapter on promises is one I point to all the time, because promises are, in a sense, I think there's this middle ground where, when you first get into promises, depending on your, experience level with JavaScript, it might be like, cool, promises, I get it, like .then, .catch, I follow it, cool. But then you get to a point where it's like, wait, what's going on? And like, I did a catch and then a then, and it's not behaving how I expected. And do I need to return? And especially in asynchronous tests, I see all the time promise-based code that's not quite right. At our work, we've kind of just taken it as a technical focus to really understand promises well, to make sure that we always can say exactly what's going on, and that every statement, every then and catch and return is intentional. But so yeah, his chapter on promises is really, really great to handle edge cases that, unless you're very senior working with promises, you probably haven't thought about quite all of them. And if you have, it's a great resource to point other developers to. So I highly recommend it. Your summary about promises and async-await was great. And I will just say, as far as usage, I find myself using both. And I don't know if I totally have a rhyme or reason for it. I know a number of different testing frameworks I've used use async-await, and that's because really in that case, actually error handling doesn't even matter, because if an exception gets thrown, cool, the test fails, tell me about it. And so you really just have that happy path that you're going through without even a try or catch. And some frameworks have async-await is like the core way they recommend using it. And sometimes in my code, I'll use async-await as well. And other times promises feels more natural to me. And I'm not sure if I have a rhyme or reason to it. I know, I've heard some folks say that because async-await hides some of the promise-based stuff that's happening under the hood, if you have a team that's very new to all this, that might be a reason to lean away from async-await and maybe to have the explicitness of promises to make it a bit easier to follow. And I'd very much be in support of that. You want to choose your JavaScript style based on your team and where they're at, while still kind of helping your team to level up. Or consulting work like we do, thinking about the client and how experienced their team is in JavaScript and where they're at. But yeah, have you all found yourselves mixing promises and async-await in your code the way I have?
I think we do, yeah. I can't think of an example offhand, but now that you say that, I think we do. We do lean more toward async-await when we can. But a good example of this is Top Level. Top Level doesn't support async-await yet, although I think it's coming in very soon, or it may have just landed. Somewhere in there. So you would need to use a .then in that case anyway. I also think sometimes the ergonomics of try-catch, wrapping in a try-catch can be kind of not as nice as just doing .then this and .catch do this other thing. And there's also sometimes situations where you want it just feels like it'll work a lot better if we just use a promise syntax. And so, or an example of this is when you want execution to continue. I want to fire this off. I know it's a promise. I want to be able to handle it, but I don't want to await. I really don't. I want to actually just have something that will handle it when it comes back, but continue the execution. And that's actually a situation where I think that we use the regular promise syntax all the time, because then your code just continues to execute and it's not waiting for everything else to finish, or waiting for that asynchronous function to finish.
Hey folks, this is Charles Max Wood, and I just launched my book, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. It's up on Amazon. We self-published it. I would love your support. If you want to go check it out, you can find it there, The Max Coder's Guide to Finding Your Dream Developer Job. Have a good one. Max out.
Another example I can think of, and this is another case where I don't quite have the theory in my head enough to be able to explain it. So maybe there's a way to do this in both syntaxes. But when I have something that I need to loop through in serially and do one at a time, a for of loop with async-await is really great because you can just await inside there. And if there's nothing in the array, you don't await inside there. You just kind of keep moving on. And so that's very, very natural to me with async-await. And if it's doable with promises, I'm not quite sure how. And so that's definitely a case I'll reach for async-await there. But yeah, in our group, like we want to have them both in our back pocket. And so kind of reaching for the one that feels more natural in a given circumstance is helpful.
Yeah, totally.
We're getting a bit close to the end of our kind of time slot here. So maybe we can focus on, there's one more big kind of grouping of features that I have benefited a lot from. So maybe let's focus on those, and then you can jump in if you have any others that you feel strongly about.
Sure.
So this is related to constructing and destructuring objects and arrays. Destructuring is the feature that I think the same word is used for both objects and arrays. I think up until React hooks, we mostly saw it with objects, where you got an object in and you say, okay, I want to pull these individual fields off of it. So you say const or let, and you put the curly's there that looks like you're defining an object literal, but then you just list out the names of the variables you want. And then nested destructuring there if you need to pull things out from lower levels. And so that was a way to kind of get a few fields out so that in the rest of your object, you're not drilling down potentially multiple levels into some passed-in object, but you've just got the individual variables that you need and they're ready to go. So that was very useful. I had seen in projects that I've been on where there's very complicated object structures we're getting, some projects, the code style encouraged destructuring for everything. Whenever you're pulling something out of an object structure, use it. I felt like at that point, the kind of personal thing that I came to is like destructuring at a top level, great. Yeah. Going one level deep, like, okay, like that works too. But if you're going 2 levels deep, to me, like a lot of the times that feels like that hinders readability. So maybe at that point, I would kind of have separate assignment statements to kind of pull those things out there. But certainly I destructure like 1 or 2 levels whenever I need something.
Yeah, so I use destructuring a lot in a CLI framework library that I maintain called GlueGun, and it's like you can build command line interfaces with it, and we pass into your command, like when someone calls your command, we pass in a toolbox, and this toolbox has all kinds of cool stuff in it. Like it's a toolbox. It's got all kinds of really nice features, like being able to pretty print various things, or being able to make network requests, or to ask the user for input, like a prompt. All these things are built in. File system access, various things. So to get these, you would generally, the way that we recommend doing is destructuring. So grab what you need, grab the features that you need out of it by saying const curly file system print, different things like that, and equals toolbox. So you're destructuring that. But within each kind of set of tools, or tool drawer, you might say, is a bunch of functions. So print has like print.info, print.debug, print.table. These are all functions within the print part of it. And you could say like print : info, debug, table. We don't recommend that. If you need to do that, put it as a separate line, const, info, debug, table equals print. And that way you have access to the print object. You can still use that if you need to, but you also have what you need destructured from the second level. That it just looks better to me, or just use print.debug. It's okay. You don't need to destructure that deeply. So I agree with you. I think that you need to be judicious in how you use those features. I love them though. They really, really make it nice, because otherwise that would be like 8 different lines of assignment to create that same thing, and you get to do it in one line.
One of the things that just occurred to me recently about the prevalence of destructuring is it actually is a subtle language influence away from using OO and away from using classes, in my opinion, because when you're pulling functions out, when you're pulling data out, it's just pulling data out. When you're pulling functions out, as you just described with Glue Gun, and I've seen with React Testing Library and other frameworks, it's necessary for those functions now to have this context bound, or to not be methods at all, to just be standalone functions. And so just because of that, when I'm thinking about creating classes, I'm thinking about, wait, is someone going to destructure the methods out of this to call? And I can't assume that they won't, because it's just so common in JavaScript. And so I would need to bind to this context. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because I love destructuring, but it's interesting that it's a subtle language pressure away from OO, because if you're using just ECMAScript classes out of the box, destructuring the methods out of them will break.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Another thing I really like about destructuring is for arguments of functions, and effectively getting to the point where you have named arguments, where the order of arguments that you pass in doesn't matter, you just pass them in by name. This is something where I don't think I'm always consistent on it, but when I'm thinking about it, I really try to reach for named arguments, or like an options object like that. You destructure from them, unless the arguments are super, super obvious. If there's one argument, probably fine. If there's one required argument and then some optional ones, or ones where it's not obvious which would come next, maybe make all those named there. But yeah, I'm trying to reach for destructuring arguments as much as possible, just because of it lowers the likelihood of errors and misunderstandings and increases the readability of the code.
Yeah, totally. This is something I got a little more used to with like Objective-C really does kind of keyword arguments. In Ruby, this is extremely common to use named arguments. In fact, they've built into the language the ability to eliminate the curly braces. You can just say, just have like a hash syntax. It's pretty interesting. Like how different languages have approached this, but I agree with you. I really like this direction. I like having up to 2 arguments. Usually, if it's one argument, that's fine. You can just pass that in. A lot of times I'll see like normal argument, maybe it's like a string, like a URL or something like that. And then an options hash, like you talked about, an options object that you can pull out the pieces that you need.
This reminds me, I think that the next feature we could go to is one that I never remember the name of it, and yet many of us use it so often. I'm trying to get it in. So it's property value shorthands, and I'll link to the Axel Rauschmeyer's blog there where he names it to give us the name. But this is kind of like restructuring. This is when you have a variable, and the name of the variable is the same as the name of the property in the object that you want to put it into. And so when you use an object literal, the curlies to create a new object literal, instead of saying property name : value, you just say variable name. And so it will use that name and use the variable there. And that is very quick for readability. I mean, it's great for those named arguments as well. And so that's another interesting language pressure. And this one, I think, a very good one. It's like, okay, I'm creating a local variable. Let me go ahead and give it the name of the argument that I'm going to pass in. And then it's very clear there. It's very obvious. I don't feel bad. Like I feel when I have a variable that is a different name and it needs to be, maybe I'm destructuring from one place and then restructuring or, recreating it somewhere else. And I feel kind of like, oh, I have to rename it. That's too bad. Like I wish I could give it the same name all the way through. But it's not a problem, but it just goes to show how nice and quick and readable it is, I think, to have those shorthands. It is something where it's like, if you're not used to that syntax, it's like, okay, well, what's happening? I just have the name of an identifier here in the curlies, like what's going on here. But I think in the front-end world, in the React world, it's so common that I think we've adopted it, and I see a lot of that value from it. Yeah,
totally. These different, the more tools you give developers, the more creative they're going to be, which can be a good and a bad thing. But in this case, yeah, it's a very clever way to use the new language features to clean up the code.
Let's say one more related to kind of destructuring, and that's rest and spread. These are very well known, I think, in the React world due to the focus on immutability and creating new objects for tracking changes and things like that. But when you and I see spread more frequently than rest. So both of them use the triple dot syntax. But so spread is like, I want to create a new object and I want all the properties from this existing object And then I want to add some others, or I want some defaults that are overridden. And so you use the triple dots to spread an object into a new object. Same with arrays. It's very common when you're setting state. I just need to add something to this array. Use array spread. REST is a bit less common. This is when you have an object or an array and you want to pull something out of it. You might say, okay, I want the first element of this array, and then I want the rest of the elements in another array, or same with objects. I don't find myself reaching for that quite as much, but I would say for the sake of immutability being more accessible in JavaScript, it's really great. I mean, this was already in place by the time I got into front-end development. And I have found myself, due to like writing shared libraries or writing Node on the server side, needing to use object assign. I think object.assign, I think, is the function that you can use to kind of simulate object spread to say, like, oh, I want a new object, and take this one, and then also take this one and put the properties together. So that was super unintuitive to me at first. It's gradually sunk in, but I think just the visual, like just visually, it's just you see a spread, and once you know the syntax, it's like, cool, I can totally see what's happening. I'm setting a new array with this one, and the contents of this array, and then a new element. So I think it would be much harder for us in this language to take an immutable approach like that if we didn't have array spread and object spread.
Yeah, for sure. And I see. I did a little bit of Elm, like I think a year and a half, 2 years ago, something like that. And one thing about Elm is that everything is immutable. You can't just mutate things. And so, how do you change one property? Well, you're going to be using basically an object spread. You're going to be taking the original object, spreading it into a new object, and then changing one property. And this is something that it was just literally the only way to get that done. And as immutability has become more and more popular in the JavaScript community, you need new tools like this in order to make it so that it's not just a big pain in the butt. Object.assign, yeah, it works. I used it for a long time as well. And you can create new objects. It works essentially the same way as spread in a lot of ways. But the nice thing about object spread is that it's very clean and concise. And just lets you create new object. It's very easy to duplicate an object. Just create a new object and spread the properties of the old object in there. Now it's a shallow clone. Like it won't like any properties will be pointing to the same exact values that they had before. So you got to be careful about that, but that's often what you want. You want a shallow clone of something. But yeah, it is very helpful. .rest I don't use nearly as often, but it does come in handy sometimes. I used it a lot in Elm when you were doing things like looping through and taking the first or the last thing off, usually the first thing off of a list. Then you'd have to take the head, the first thing, and then leave the tail and pass that through so that it could then be the new object, and then you'd grab the head of that. And so this is how you kind of just peel one off at a time and leave the rest for the rest of the function as you're doing an iteration. That's something you can do in JavaScript a little easier because they have built in kind of for each and map methods where you had to do things a little differently. And,
You've mentioned Elm and a few other languages, and I'm also someone who has worked in some different programming languages. And I think your comparison to Elm especially draws out how something that's new to JavaScript, that's maybe unintuitive in JavaScript, is super foundational in another language. Same with what you said about async and await. And so I think there's value when folks can or do work in other languages to see a feature kind of in its native habitat, in a sense. And so I always want to make sure when I remember not to pressure anybody. Hey, if you're newer in your career, or you just like to work 40 hours and then go do non-programming stuff, or you're feeling overwhelmed at work, just kind of keeping your head above water, hey, do not feel pressure to learn any of these new features or learn any new languages. Hey, you were doing great. But for folks who are feeling an itch to kind of learn more, or I just wish I knew what was happening under the hood, digging into these ECMAScript features and reading Axel Rauschmeyer's docs would be a great way to do it. Another way is just to learn another language. Do it as a hobby, even if you're not planning on using it at work. It's a great way just to look at things from a new point of view, and it can make different ECMAScript features that are coming in from different sources more intuitive to you. So if you feel the mental space for it, fits your stage of life and your schedule, learning a new language on the side, just for fun, just enough to get your brain working in a different way can be a great idea.
Yeah, and sometimes I forget that I've been doing this for 26, 27 years since I was 12 years old.
Yeah, me too.
And so, we've had lots of time to work through this. We've had, when I absolutely think that learning new languages is a huge deal. When I became a Ruby developer, I became a much better PHP developer, which was what I had done before. I was just better at doing PHP because I got a chance to see how the Rubyists did it, and there were some really good ideas there. When I moved to Objective-C, then I got better at doing Ruby. Because there were some really interesting things that came out of that. But realize that these were like 5 years at a time, right? So if you're 2 years into your career, you haven't had time. I didn't even do anything but QBasic for the first 6 years of my life, of my programming life. So I started doing a little C++ and it just blew my mind. I didn't know how to do that. I did Visual Basic for applications, VBA for a few years. I did PHP for 5 years. These are things that once you're 20 years into your career, you'll have done a lot of languages too. I guarantee it. You're going to have, and you're going to be a much better programmer because of it. But these things don't expect when you're 2 years into your career to have 5 languages under your belt. I had 1 at that point.
It's a great point about the time scale. Absolutely. So, Jamon,
and a reminder that we're both old.
Exactly. In case you didn't catch it in many things that we've said. So, Jamon, are there any other particular ECMAScript features that come to mind for you that you get really excited by or really burned by and avoid at all costs? Any you want to draw our attention to before we go to picks?
I love string literals, template literals. Basically, the ability to use the backtick and do like what's the word? Interpolation?
Interpolation.
Yes, interpolation. Thank you. Basically, take a variable or even just an expression and drop it right into the middle of the string and build your string that way. It's really, really helpful. Use it all the time. It's something that I really, really love. And I understand why they had to kind of introduce a new string syntax in order to do that, because you have all these websites out there and you couldn't guarantee that just changing the semantics of what a double quote was or something like that wouldn't break a bunch of websites. So they had to use the backtick, which is fine. And but I really love using the string literals. Those are extremely helpful. A little more kind of esoteric proxies, I think, are interesting. Proxies are interesting because of we use MobX state tree at Infinite Red, and proxies allow us under the hood to watch objects for changes and then re-render React components when those properties change, which is really nice for performance, because it's like, hey, only this object or only this component is using this property from this object, and so only re-render that one. Don't re-render the whole app. It just makes things really, really easy for things like that. You can do that without proxies, because there is a version of MobX that doesn't use proxies, and it's just fine. It's just that proxies are more performant and simpler code. I think they use getters and setters under the hood, which is another new feature.
Now, my experience with proxies has been similar. I haven't used them directly, but I've used libraries like MobX. Vue.js also uses proxies in certain versions of it, newer versions of it. And yeah, it's something that I like to rely on under the hood that I don't find myself needing to reach for directly. Same thing with generators. This is the feature of ECMAScript. When I was reading Axel's books, I got to that and I was like, I do not follow this, not for any fault of his, but like, I don't follow this, and I have not yet found a case where I need to write this myself. And so I will say thank you to ECMAScript, and thank you library authors that are using them to great effect, and thank you for giving me simpler APIs to work with. So it's not things that I interface with directly.
I didn't use generator functions directly until I started doing kind of side effect oriented code, where originally Redux sagas was a way to introduce that. It basically allowed you to have these very long running flows, like where you're literally waiting for a user to hit a button or something before you move on. And also in MobX state tree, they have flows, and those are the same thing where you're like, okay, I'm going to show this dialog box, wait for them to hit OK, and do the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And there are some cases where using a generator function works better than using async-await. However, for the most part, those are a low-level feature. It's just kind of like under the hood. It's doing something different than than async-await would. And the one thing I would like to do at some point is make a little video showing how would you build a generator function by hand? Like how would you transpile it by hand? Like, hey, here's a generator, and then how would you turn that into regular code? Because it's actually not that hard. It's like a giant switch statement that people could look at and totally understand. So I might do that at some point, like build a little video about that, and then people would understand what generators are.
Yeah, I definitely benefit from that for sure.
Yeah, I might put that on my list.
There you go. Any other features you want to talk about?
I think just little ergonomic things like being able to do the trailing commas in function perimeter lists. We used decorators for a little while. I'm not as big of a fan of decorators. They look a little funny to me. They do clean things up sometimes. Basically, it's just wrapping something in a function is more or less all it's doing, but it's doing it with a syntax that, again, reduces the indentation levels. And a few other things like for of. And so I'm just not, these aren't things that impact me quite as intensely as maybe some of the other ones do.
Right. Cool. Well, thanks for the discussion. That was really fun to dig into these things and totally. Share our experiences, the difference these features have made. And it's cool. Well, some folks may be excited or not so excited about the pace of ECMAScript changes. But either way, hopefully some things will come your way that are helpful and useful, and just define the subset for your team. And hopefully you can have a productive conversation going about that, or just go with Prettier.
Exactly.
Yeah. Sweet. Well, let's go to picks. My picks for today, I'm going to keep it simple and just re-pick the things I mentioned before. Babel is awesome. Donate to Babel. And Axel Rauschmeyer's books are awesome. So check them out to go deeper into JavaScript. And we'll kind of repeat the links from earlier on those. Jamon, how about you? What picks do you have?
I have a little self-serving pick here, a little promotional. We released a course using TensorFlow.js, so JavaScript. You get to use all the new language features, but in machine learning. And so if you go to academy.infinite.red, you can check out that course. There's also a free mini course that introduces you to the concepts of machine learning. You do not need to be a developer or a very experienced developer to take this mini course. You're going to learn a lot, and it's free. So definitely check that out. And then there's the paid course, Beginning Machine Learning with TensorFlow.js. My business partner, Gant Laborde, put that together. There aren't a lot of systems that allow you to do machine learning and AI in JavaScript, but TensorFlow.js is one of them, and it's probably the best one. And this course teaches you how to use it. You actually create models and things like that. So check that out. You'll get to use all these new language features in a whole new realm.
I'm excited to see the research Gant's been doing in that area. That's very cool. All right. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for listening in, everyone, and we'll catch you again soon for another episode of React Native Radio. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.